We are carrying on our series through Ephesians. Don't worry, I'm not going to do a normal length sermon or anything today. You know, we've got a picnic to get onto and all that kind of thing. But I did want to say a few things about today's passage to the grown-ups in the room. So we are in Ephesians 5, and we begin at verse 21. And verse 21 really is the key verse of this whole thing. So if you don't get too hooked on all the rest of the details, it's this first verse that is essential for what we're talking about today. So, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is to the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Okay, so this is just so exciting to be standing up again. As we've seen, kids can be really cute and really not cute. There's kind of both potential in them. You know, spend any amount of time with them and you will eventually come to that moment where they simply won't do what you've asked them to do. Just the other day, we were at a friend's house and saw this kind of lived out a few times. My favorite moment was when the kids wanted to play with the hose. Kids just obsessed with splashing each other with water and playing with the hose. And, you know, eventually dad said, okay, no more turning on the hose. But then, you know, his son turned around and says, but I want to. I said, but I said no. But I want to. But I said no. And, you know, that is just that classic scene that plays on and on with parents and their children. I said no, but I want to. But the thing is, there is a part of us that never moves on from that immaturity and still kicks out and screams and says, but I want to. Like, if you think about this whole of the last year, all kinds of restrictions and especially masks has kicked off the toddler in a lot of us that said, but I don't want to. I don't like this. I want to be free. I want to do what I want to do. And, you know, even in childhood, Jesus has something to teach us on this. We heard earlier the story of how he went missing. Their parents and the big family unit had gone to Jerusalem. Them and all their friends would have gone together. And in Jerusalem, Jesus had gone missing, and they didn't realize until they were halfway home because they assumed someone else was looking after him. And so they frantically go looking for Jesus. You know, the angels have told you you've got the most important person who's ever been born, the Son of God, to look after, and you've gone and lost him. So they're freaking out. But when they find him, he's in the temple, blowing the minds of the religious kind of clerics of his day with his deep knowledge of God. So, you know, even in his earliest days, we find Jesus practicing submission in two forms. One, he is learning all about God. He's got this deep knowledge of God, which would form the pattern of all of his ministry. There's one time where Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father doing. In other words, I don't do what I want to do. I do what I see my Father in heaven doing. And even as a child, when his parents said, okay, time to go home now, you've had your fun in the temple, he obeys and he follows. So even the Son of God, the one through whom everything was created, the one who rules and reigns now and will rule and reign in the future over the whole universe, submitted himself to his earthly parents, to Mary and Joseph, and submitted himself to his Father in heaven. And that would become one of the defining characteristics for his ministry. And we're told in this passage in Ephesians that this submission, this obedience is a requirement for things to go well, both for us as people, for our families, and for our nation. It comes with a promise that when children obey their parents, it goes well in the whole world. It's part of the way that God has made things to work. And so when we kick against it, we're actually kicking against the stability in our own communities. It has this profound effect on us and others. And this, our passage today, which was written to a bunch of people living in Ephesus, in modern-day Greece, is speaking in the 1st century, giving instructions to followers of Jesus, and specifically to 3 sets of relationships: husbands and wives, parents and children, slaves and masters. And it's easy in the detail of all of these instructions to miss the big picture of what this passage is fundamentally about. Those relationships, husbands, wives, parents, children, masters, and slaves, was the ancient home. They were all the relationships that happened in the home. The home was also the workplace. And so you had slaves that worked for you. And again, slaves is not how we understand slaves. It ran all the way from those who were treated horrifically through to those who were basically a trusted part of the family and would inherit the estate. So there was a whole range of things going on there. We can think white collar workers, low paid type people, maybe something like that. And then, as today, there were all kinds of people that didn't fit into those categories in the church that they were writing to. There were people who were widowed. There were people who were orphans. There were people who were divorced. There were people who used to be slaves who were now freed men and women. And so is this letter simply got nothing to say to them? No, it's a much bigger picture than that. What Paul is doing is using this one set of relationships as an example for how Christians can live in every sphere of life. And what he's pointing out then is in their world, they had these relationships where someone was in charge and someone was under them. And he's saying how Christians should live in those kind of dynamics. To summarize it even further, what he's saying is this is what it looks like to imitate Jesus at home and at work, with your boss and with the people that you're in charge of, with your husband and wife and with your kids and with your parents. This is what it looks like to follow Jesus in each of those relationships. And the lesson is submission. In his famous book on the spiritual disciplines, Richard Foster, The Celebration of Discipline, writes this about submission. What freedom corresponds to submission? It is the ability to lay down the terrible burden of always needing to have our own way. The obsession to demand that things go the way we want them to go is one of the great bondages in human society today. People will spend weeks, months, even years in perpetual stew because some little thing did not go as they wish. Or to put it in other words, we still have that fuming toddler within us that is desperate to get what we want, how we want it, and when we want it. But submission offers us the freedom from those temper tantrums, from being stuck in that stew when things didn't go the way things went, how we wanted them to go. Submission teaches us the freedom of not getting our own way. And as this gets into our muscle memory, into our ways of thinking, into our outlook on life, we discover a happiness that is no longer dependent on external circumstances, is not dependent on everything and everyone in our lives going well, because we suddenly realize it's not all about us. We're not in charge. We're not number one. We're not the most important one in the room. Right now, there is a great deal of misery in our culture because it's quite a narcissistic culture. There's a whole series of surveys done on young people over the last decade that have found time and time again the number one thing that young people want to grow up to be is famous. And that almost didn't used to feature at all, even a few decades ago. But more and more, we've become this narcissistic culture where actually we're told it is all about me and I need to be big and bold and out there and approved by everyone and everything needs to go my way. And that isn't actually healthy for us. That is a cage that makes us miserable. But submission and practicing submission to people who are in authority over us is actually how we find the freedom of right-sizing ourselves and realizing we are not the great I am. God is, and we are not. And even when God comes to earth and lives a full human life, he does so in submission. Even Jesus does that. And so this example of Jesus, where he lived in submission and ultimately went to the cross, the ultimate act of submission, not doing what he wanted, but what was good for the world. He did it out of love for the world, but also in obedience to the Father who had asked him to go there. And we see that in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was not keen on going through with this thing. And there was more suffering going on there than simply the physical stuff. There was a suffering that we would never understand, someone who had been permanently connected to the Father and all of that. He went through this deep suffering because of love for us, for the benefit of us, and out of obedience for the Father. He was not getting his own way on the cross, but he was doing what he had been asked to do. And with that way of life became an ethic in the early church. And that's why we get it in this letter, and we get it in all of the letters, that people should live for the benefit of others, put others' needs before their own, to think of others before they think of themselves. And that genuinely frees us from self-pity and self-absorption, which are not healthy places for us to live as human beings. But I can't talk about this whole thing of submission without mentioning that, yes, of course, it has been abused in the past. People have abused their status, their authority, and their power over other people. And in fact, Richard Foster, writing in the Celebration of Discipline, thinks amongst all of the spiritual disciplines, this is the one that gets abused the most. So what do we do with that? Well, the first and I think most important thing is a really important principle that I wish more people knew about. I don't speak Latin, but so I'm probably going to say this wrong, but it is abusus non tillit usum, which means the misuse of something is no argument against its proper use. So in other words, because there are, for example, bad workplaces, we don't give up on the idea of working together. Working all together, or because there are bad workplaces, we don't give up on our own workplace becoming healthy. Because there are bad marriages, we don't give up on the idea of marriage altogether. Because some people abuse their power, it does not mean that there aren't people who can use their power well. And because there are bad churches, we don't give up on the whole idea of church altogether. And that, it applies to so many fields today where people will point to a bad example of something and say, well, we need to throw it out. And that is not true. What this is saying is that power can be used well, and submission is good for us when it is healthy. In the time that this was written, there were an awful lot of things going on in the households of their day that would, make us flinch, make us embarrassed almost to see this written and encouraged almost in the Bible. It was absolute patriarchy. You think we have patriarchy now? Back then, the man of the house was everything. His will was the will of God. Everything he said got done. Slaves, women, and children were all in their own ways viewed as less human than the man who was in charge. For example, some philosophers believed that the slaves who worked at the time didn't even have the capacity to think straight, to think logically. They were seen almost as half animal. Children weren't seen or viewed or treated as fully human until they became adults. And women were also, not treated as equals back then. And so many looking back at passages like this seem to see that the Bible is encouraging these broken institutions to carry on. And their question, why was not a letter written tearing down these institutions? But when you look at what's actually happening, this imitation of Jesus in the way of using power well and submitting to authority was placing a far more explosive charge under all of those broken relationships than any amount of external campaigning could have achieved. So, for example, in a world where slaves and women didn't have any decision-making power, this letter, which is addressed directly to them, which again never would have normally happened, was saying there is dignity and importance in the decisions that you make, that you can make good and bad decisions, and it matters what you do. It addresses children who were never addressed, were not important enough to ever be addressed in a letter. That was seen as crazy, and it was giving advice to them. What it's doing throughout is giving dignity and decision-making power to these people and asking them to imitate Christ in his submission in the place that they have, in the home or in the workplace. And what we read as oppressive or overbearing would have been read as scandalously liberating at the time. And so it was that within decades of the Jesus movement starting, we already see the treatment of women, slaves, and children alter radically to the culture around them. Women were prophesying and leading in church, which would have been unthinkable. Slaves were, and we've got letters in the New Testament that match out this exact thing, were being treated within the church as equal to their masters. These people that were seen as less than human were being told that you have equal value and status when you are in the church as the people in charge. And there is a whole letter written to a runaway slave who took the freedom of Christ very literally, trying to reunify him to the family that he ran away from, but for all to see each other as equals. And so what Richard Foster writes in The Celebration of Discipline about submission is it becomes unhealthy at the point at which it leaves the transformative love of Jesus and becomes destructive. So in other words, this way of practicing submission to those who are in charge of us, of loving them well, and for those who have power to use it well to those below, that will transform the world. But the moment it leaves that pattern, when it becomes abusive or destructive, they are the limits to when we stop practicing the spiritual discipline. And of course, we need to remember that this passage has within it quite a severe warning to anyone who is in charge, that the one they are in charge of has a master, and you have a master, and that is Jesus. And that is a not too subtle warning that you are being watched in how you treat those who are under you. And again, the New Testament throughout has these repeated warnings that to be a leader, to be in charge, to have authority carries double the weight and double the judgment. It is not to be taken lightly. And we are to treat those we are in charge of well. And when this mutual submission that we've read about today, powered by the example and love of Jesus, has its chance to work through societies and families, it changes lives. It changes those families. It changes those neighborhoods. It changes those societies. So Jesus isn't just shuffling around the balance of power and putting some checks and measures and things like this. He is transforming the whole attitude of how we relate to other people. You know, we had the heartbreak of the European Cup final last week. But I think, for myself, that is the best England team I have ever seen as long as I've been alive. And really, penalties are mostly luck. Let's be honest, penalties are mostly luck. So they would just look away from winning a European Cup. And what is extraordinary is, and the reason why they were so successful, is that is not a superstar team. When I was younger, Lizzie was younger, growing up, it was all about the superstars in the team, the great people, the heroes. But that team and their large bench were almost interchangeable. Almost anyone could have been on that pitch and achieved that because they were all submitting to one another. They were all, they were there to serve one another. They were not there to grab the headlines, to be this hero, to be the superstar. They were genuinely a team serving one another. That's why they worked so well. They were literally setting one another up to win. When you've got selfish people in a team, it doesn't work. When you set each other up to win, then it works. And that's, the natural law and part of what Jesus is teaching here, why children need to obey their parents. That's how it works. That's how everyone succeeds. So those of us who hold authority, in the home or in the workplace, we are to use that power and that authority well to serve those who we are in charge of, to seek their flourishing and their well-being. They are not there to serve us. We are there to serve them. For those of us who have people in charge of us, we're not there to gossip against them or slander them or make their job harder, but to serve them well, to set them up to win, so that everyone in the home and in the workplace is setting each other up to win. And I know a lot of the language in this, slaves especially, but the husband and wife language to our ears sounds incredibly old-fashioned. But just imagine if being a man meant loving your wife with the care and passion that Jesus has towards us. Because that's what this passage is saying. What if we could leave behind the vacuum of male identity, which is basically just criticism at this point, and the whole criticism of toxic masculinity, which is fair, but actually replace it with something. Replace it with the leadership style of Christ. Imagine if instead of being workaholics, alcoholics, or completely passive in the home, we could offer men the option of being servant leaders in the home, carrying the godly responsibility for the flourishing and well-being of their families. Imagine households where husbands and wives loved each other with the depth and sacrifice and commitment with which Jesus has for us. Imagine households where children weren't yelled at and frustrated, but instead were treated gently and raised in the example of Jesus. Where husbands and wives loved each other deeply and put all of their needs second to the needs of their spouse. That's not just a better outcome for their family. That is a revolution that this world genuinely needs. And what if our community as a church was a genuine family, so that single people didn't get relegated to the status of having to wait until they were matched up to be fully human, or asked, have you found anyone yet? Or are you going to have kids? When are you going to have kids? What if we were a community of such mutual submission that we could be a full family and we could honor people in their singleness? Christianity has always called people to one of two things, to marriage or to devoted singleness. Those are the two options that we call people into, and we should have room for both. We should be family for both. We should be supporting families like Rich and Ellie and Eliza and Lois, and we should be supporting and encouraging and enveloping our single people too. We should be family who practice mutual submission, who set one another up for win, who put other people's needs before our own needs. And look, I know this runs completely counter to the spirit and the advice of the age, which is all about boundaries and self-care. But sometimes I feel like that stuff is like slamming the brakes on a parked car. Jesus calls us to sacrificial love. It's what he practiced. And there is a time to be wise, and there is a time to pull back, and there is a time to rest. And a lot of us need to learn that lesson too. But if our lives are all self-care and boundaries, we actually end up in a poor, sad, and shriveled state. But when we sacrifice and we put ourselves out there, when we're worried about not having enough energy or not having enough stuff, those are the moments when we're past our own capacities that God comes in and fills in those gaps. So rather than living for ourselves, It's time for us to grow out of the toddler phase, become spiritual adults that recognize we are here to love and serve other people, and it is not about us. We are players on the stage of eternity, and God is calling us into a much bigger story, one in which we love and serve others, where we put our needs second to the needs of others. This is foundational to Christianity. It should not be controversial. So let's start with us. If we have people who are in charge of us, whether it's our parents or our boss, let us submit to that authority and do our jobs well, because we do it for Jesus. If we hold power over others, let us also use that power in the service of the well-being and flourishing of those people.